So for today's seminar, we have Dr. Meghan Critchley. So Meghan did her undergrad at the University of Wyoming in the US in dance science. And then she stayed at the University of Wyoming to complete a master's degree, a master's of science in biomechanics. And then she came to the University of Calgary for a PhD in kinesiology, supervised by Sarah Kenny. And then now she's a postdoctoral fellow in the Sports Injury Prevention Research Center with Dr. Carolyn Emery. So today she's going to be giving a seminar talking about informing injury prevention in developing youth dancers.
Okay. Thanks, Steph. So yeah, my name is Meghan. I am from the States, moved up here to do my PhD. And today I'll be talking a little bit about my PhD research and how it's kind of informed what we're doing in my postdoc research. So I've kind of been secluded in Cyprus and in the dance world. So for those of you who don't know me, she kind of just introduced this, but I'm originally from Wyoming, which is basically just two states. If you go through Montana, you're then in Wyoming. If you're watching the show Yellowstone, Yellowstone is in Wyoming. It's nothing like the show, but that's kind of what people know about us. When I was little, I grew up doing basically any kind of aesthetic sport activity I could get my hands on. So I started dancing probably around 6 or 7. I did gymnastics for a while, and then typical American. In high school, I was a cheerleader. But yeah, I kind of just stuck with dance throughout that whole time and eventually ended up going to the University of Wyoming and getting my Bachelor of Fine Arts in dance with a concentration in dance science. And then, yeah, I stayed, did a master's in biomechanics, and then at a conference met Dr. Sarah Kenny, who was up here. So I moved up here to do my PhD and kind of was able to blend my passion for science and dance through my PhD. And that's some of the work I'll be talking about today. And now in my spare time, I teach ballet to little kiddos. Almost none of the kids in this photo are doing what they're supposed to be doing, but that's fine. They'll get there. And so, yeah, let's kind of set the stage here. So in 2014, Canada Council for the Arts conducted a mapping exercise to gauge who's dancing, where is dance happening in the country. And at that time, Calgary actually had the highest number of private dance studios per capita compared to any other urban centers in Canada. So Calgary is a really big dance city. We have a couple of professional companies. So the Alberta Ballet is one, Decidedly Jazz Dance Works. There's a lot of freelance dancing going on. And then there's actually a really successful dance program here at the university. And then if we looked, there was a survey of 24 Calgary high schools and junior highs. And what we found was that one of the top 3 activities for adolescent girls is dance, followed by basketball and then volleyball. So not only is there a lot of studios in Calgary, but it's also got a high rate of participation among adolescent girls in this city. Today we'll be talking about mostly concert dance. So this includes 4 major styles: ballet, modern, which is also sometimes called contemporary, jazz, and then tap. These used to be referred to as Western dance styles, but I think living in Canada, we can recognize why using the term Western means that we're excluding some actually traditional Indigenous dances in that term, right? So we've kind of shifted to the concert dance terminology instead of Western to be a little more clear about what we're talking about. So not only are we talking about concert dance today, but we're going to specifically talk about ballet. So ballet is often considered a foundational technique for dancers. This is what young kids usually start with. Usually around the age of 3, they enter a pre-dance class that's mostly ballet focused, and then eventually they'll start doing those other dance genres. The origins of ballet can be traced to the 16th century. It started as court dances. So royal courts would commission ballets that told these grand stories of whatever, and then eventually it kind of became more, it branched out of the royal class. Classical ballet is very story driven, and the choreography is characterized by repetitive weight bearing, especially in extreme plantar flexion like you're seeing here. It's categorized by jumps, partnering, in which typically a male partner is lifting a female partner, It's categorized by extreme flexibility, so a lot of range of motion seen at the hip, and then dynamic balance, so a lot of single leg activity on your toes. So I think we can see from some of these images why there's potentially, it's very beautiful, but there's potentially a risk of injury here. So what we do know about the epidemiology of dance injury is that reported injury rates in dance, specifically pre-professional and professional dancers, it's categorized as high risk. It's among the top 6 for injury risk in female adolescents, so it's popular and risky. When we look at the prevalence of dance injury, we see a wide range from 47% of dancers getting injured in a season all the way to 100% in some professional companies. And then when we look at the incidence of injury, so the number of new injuries throughout a year, we see a range from about 0.77 to 4.71 injuries per 1,000 dance hours. And so if we go with that 4.71 or that higher end of this range and we compare it to other sports, we're seeing that it has a similar risk profile to girls soccer or female adolescent soccer, and it's higher than gymnastics and figure skaters. So if we're comparing to other athletic sports or activities, it's higher, and then at kind of the equivalent with some other non-contact or non-collision sports for girls. Of these injuries, based on the videos that you saw before, I think it makes sense that what we see, they are mostly gradual onset lower limb injuries. That's the most common. And then there's a huge fear and avoidance culture in ballet and dance. So there's fear surrounding both getting injured and then telling people you're injured. So in a professional company, injuries that require reporting to a medical professional and therefore your artistic director sometimes results in a fear of losing your position or your role within the company. So in a ballet company, there's specific roles and positions, and they're often contractual on a year-to-year basis. So if you're out with a severe ACL tear, there's somebody that's going to take your role, and you might not get signed for next year, even if you do rehab properly. So there's a big fear around that. And this is common in other athletes, but dancers also have a huge fear of taking time away from training. So in a professional company and then at the pre-professional school that we'll talk about later, they're dancing about 20 to 25 hours a week, so five-ish hours a day. And they feel that if they take one of those 5-hour chunks off, they all of a sudden will no longer be good at ballet, which is not true. But this is just kind of how the culture is and how they're taught. I think it's changing a little bit, but that's kind of where we're at the moment. So when we're talking about this though, so I've told you all this stuff about injuries and the epidemiology of injury in ballet and pre-professional ballet, but what I gave you these ranges of prevalence, ranges of incidence, and I've told you lower limb injuries are the most common, but really what we don't know is that there's been really inconsistent injury surveillance methodology in dance in general. So we often have different definitions of injury. We have different definitions of exposure, all kinds of issues with how we're conducting this. So this is kind of what we've tried to work against. And really we want to do this because the burden of injury in dancers is really important, because we know that when dancers get injured, it limits their artistic ability and development. Dance is an art as well as a physical, it's physical and art, right? And what we want dancers to be able to do is express themselves through their body. It reduces the participation in dance. So we know that people, or specifically adolescent girls, drop out of dance typically around 15 or 16. And then what we do know of professional dancers is they typically retire around 27 due to injury. They're unable to continue to perform. And then we also know that there's a lot of long-term consequences, such as osteoarthritis resulting from some of these injuries that these dancers are experiencing early in their careers, later on once they have retired. So some of you might have seen this, but we're going to go over it. This is the sport injury sequence of prevention model by Van Mechelen. It has 4 steps. So this is kind of how we go about trying to fix the big problem that I've been telling you is huge. So the first step is establishing the extent of the problem. So how many injuries are there? Where do they happen? Is it actually an issue? And then step 2 is establishing the etiology or mechanism. So what are the risk factors for these injuries? Then based on steps 1 and steps 2, can we combine that information, introduce a preventative intervention at step 3, and then basically at step 4, we just repeat the cycle to see if our prevention measure worked. So we're going to kind of use this sequence of prevention to talk about the research that we've done at the Alberta Ballet School to kind of guide this presentation as well. So this brings me to the objectives of my PhD research. So the first was to establish normative values of pre-season screening measures. So at the beginning of the year, we always take pre-season screening measures, but what do they actually mean? The second objective we'll talk about is kind of establishing the epidemiology, so the extent and characteristics of those injuries across 5 academic training years, so from 2015 to 2019. And then the last one will be to evaluate if any of those preseason screening measures are associated with injury to therefore inform a preventative measure. So this brings me to the first thing that we've done is establishing some normative data. This was published earlier this year. And so this is what we do with our dancers at the beginning of each season. So in September, we go in for 4 days and do a pre-season dancer screening. They complete a baseline questionnaire that asks some basic things like how old they are, how many injuries they've had, how long they've been training and what kind of styles they train in. We're at a ballet school, so we know they do ballet, but what else are they training? And then there's research to show that poor psychological coping skills are associated with injury in dancers. So they fill out an athletic coping skills inventory. We do calculate their body mass index. We have some measures of bone mineral density. And then these are the dance specific tests that we have them do. So we measure their active standing turnout. So the amount of external rotation that they have at the hip. So almost every movement in classical ballet is done in this externally rotated position. This right here is called first position. This is the first thing you learn. And you will come back to that through every movement. So your hips are externally rotated. We measure that. We measure their ankle range of motion, dorsal and plantar flexion. We do a couple tests of their lumbo-pelvic control. So that's this one leg standing test. Can you see this? Yep, one leg standing test. Knee lift abdominal test and active straight leg raise. And then we measure their dynamic balance through an eyes closed unipedal test on a blue foam that they all hate, but it's a really good test of their balance. And then the Y balance test, which they're all really good at, so they like. So yeah, when we look at how they do on these tests, so this is a huge table, but we have it separated into females, males, and then within the school, there's a junior division and a senior division. So juniors are grades 7, 9, seniors are grades 10 through, they have a postgraduate program, like grade 13, basically. And what we can see here is for their ankle range of motion and their dynamic balance tests, these values all fall within published values in other dance and athletic cohorts. But when we look at their active standing turnout, so their hip external rotation, we did find that the senior males had significantly less turnout than the other 3 groups, which was interesting to find. But this was the kicker for us. So I think when we think of ballet dancers or dancers in general, we expect them to have a really strong, active core, and they are using their core. But when we look at these tests of lumbo-pelvic control, what we're finding is large proportions, so ranging from about 20% of them all the way up to 80% of them are demonstrating that they're using their hip flexors or their hip hiking to lift their leg up. So rather than using just their core muscles, they're engaging muscles lower in the hip as well, which was not something we expected to see. So we gave this back to the staff, said, here's some areas you can target. And then we kind of moved on a little further, and I'll come back to this in the end. But so then what we went on to do is look at how do these things, how are they related with injury? But first we needed to know how much are these dancers getting injured. So we looked across 5 years, so from 2015 to 2019. The way we did this is we used 3 different definitions of injury. So an all complaints definition just basically meant they told us they were having an injury. They may be still dancing through it. They may be modifying, whatever. They just reported, I'm experiencing pain and an injury. A medical attention definition kind of makes sense. They went and saw a medical professional, an injury resulting in reporting to a medical professional. And then a time loss injury was an injury that resulted in them taking a day off, not the day they got injured, but the next day away beyond the day. So beyond the day of onset, they have to take a full day away from training due to that injury. And I think based on what I've told you, we can see why that might be an issue for these dancers. How we track this is via an online survey that gets sent to them every week. So it's the Oslo Sports Trauma Research Center questionnaire on health problems. It has 4 basic questions surrounding participation, their training volume, their performance, and any other symptoms. So if they say no to all 4 of these questions, they're done. Takes 15 seconds. If they say yes to any of them, there's some further questions that we'll ask, such as injury location, was it diagnosed by anybody, did you take time away, stuff like that. And then they also fill out a dance exposure hour survey, reporting on how many hours they danced in the previous week, in class, rehearsal, and then performance. Okay, so across these 5 years, we had 452 dancers participate in this injury surveillance. Like I said, it's a junior high school combined, so the median age is about 15. There are way more females in this cohort than males, but this is pretty typical for a pre-professional ballet school. A lot of them have been training for at least half of their life, and then almost 50% of them reported having an injury in the last year. That just kind of describes who they are. When we look at their injuries, so across the 5 years, 791 new injuries were reported, not total health problems, but new injuries. And then when we look at using an all complaints definition, we see that 67% of them were injured at some point in the 5 years. And that breaks down to an injury rate about 2.54 injuries per 1,000 dance hours. So for this particular cohort, 1,000 dance hours is almost exactly their year, so September to end of May. So that means that these dancers are experiencing 2.5 injuries per year, which can be pretty devastating to their training if they are injured that many times during the year. So this had our highest proportion and our highest injury rate. The lowest, which I think makes sense, is when we look at it via a time loss definition. We're seeing 30% of them experience a time loss injury, so an injury that required them to take time away. And then our injury rate goes way down when we come here. So it's 0.76 injuries per 1,000 dance hours. So what we've shown, and then this has been shown in other dancing cohorts, is that if we're using an injury definition, such as time loss or even medical attention, we're not really capturing what's going on with injuries in a dancing cohort. Because what's happening is these dancers are continuing to dance and they're modifying what they're doing. So they're either changing their choreography, or they're skipping out on just the jumping portion of class, but they're doing all the rest of their 2-hour class. They're not sitting out, or some of them are even sitting at the back and only doing port de bras, which is arms, but they're not dancing anymore. So we've kind of found that using that definition of injury for this population is not appropriate based on our research question. It can be in other times, but for what we're trying to do, an all complaints definition was more inclusive in what we wanted to know. When we look at where these injuries are happening, and this also is not very surprising, but the most injured location was the ankle, followed by the hip, and then the knee. So we are seeing lower limb injuries. When we look at how many days missed because of these injuries, so if we look at all of the injuries, so the all complaints injuries, we see 0.79 days missed, which means they didn't miss a day, which is what I was just saying. They didn't take time off. But if they do end up getting a time loss injury, they're taking about an average of 3 days away. So not even a full week. And then with the ostracy, there's a severity score that can be calculated. It's a score from 0 to 100. For all complaint injuries, the average score was about 32, but for substantial injuries, jumps up to about 51. Yes. Okay. So when we look at the weekly injury prevalence across, this is just 1 year, but a similar pattern was demonstrated across all 5 years. So on the bottom, we have the month of their academic year. They go from September to June. And then on our y-axis, we have the proportion of dancers injured in a week. So it ranges from 0% to almost 35, 40%. And we have our different injury definitions on here, so you can kind of see how they layer up. So the red is our all complaints definition. The yellow is our medical attention injuries, followed by the like goldish color is the substantial injuries, and then our orange at the bottom is our time loss injuries. So we can kind of see how, if we look across the year, how these injury definitions fall from weekly proportions. But what we can also see is that there are significant valleys, and these happen to line up with school breaks. So winter break, spring break, they're not getting injured because they're not dancing, which makes sense. But then some of these peaks, when we met with the artistic staff of the school, so these peaks directly line up with certain rehearsal times for the school. So like this peak in November is when Nutcracker rehearsals ramp up, which makes sense. This peak right before their spring break is when they start the choreography for their end of year performance, and then they continue to rehearse in April. And this particular year, they were rehearsing for not only their end of year performance, but then I think the Alberta Ballet was doing, they might have been doing Sleeping Beauty, which also has a child cast. So some of the students were also dancing with the Alberta Ballet. And so their rehearsal hours were ramped up. So we can see that the valleys basically align with when they're not dancing, and the peaks align with where they are dancing a lot, which kind of gives some implications about training load for these dancers. Okay, so we're here. We know there's a problem. We know how many injuries, where they're getting injured. What do we do now? So if we move on to step 2, we look at the relationship between those preseason screening measures that I talked about and then injuries. And so we did a zero inflated Poisson model and found that there's a lot of things at play here. So when we consider years of previous training and then their psychological coping skills, we can see that specific lumbopelvic control tasks, so poor lumbopelvic control, and then poor dynamic balance are associated with injury with side-to-side differences. So if they have large side-to-side differences, also a problem. We found that years of previous training was protective. So the longer that they've trained in ballet, the lower their injury risk was. And then psychological coping skills had kind of a variable effect. So we would like to think that the better their coping skills are, the less risky or the less at risk they are, but it was kind of variable across the board. But it needed to be adjusted for in our models. Okay, we're back to this model. We've done 1 and 2. Now what about 3? So we know they're injured. We know they are consistently injured across 5 years. We're now in year 9 of the study. Do we just let them do what they do and call it good? So what we've actually done is along with their artistic staff, have implemented a cross-training program in their curriculum. So how many of you know dancers? Like have a sister who danced or danced yourselves? Have a kid that's in a dance class? Okay, well, that's less than I expected actually. But when you talk to dancers love to do what they're good at, and they train and they like to do dance specific training. So they love things like yoga and Pilates because it's basically just doing the same thing that they do at the bar, laying on the ground sometimes. But when you tell them to run or jump, not in an externally rotated position, but to keep their feet parallel, it's like a whole new world. It makes no sense. And so it takes a little bit of coaching. So in year 7 of the study, which would have been 2 years ago, we implemented a cross-training program actually it would have been last year. So last year they did a cross-training program and they're continuing to work on it this year, but basically they're learning basic conditioning. So they're doing some balance tests, they're doing some balance stuff, they're working on power, they're working on core stability, And then, like we said, psychological coping skills play a role. So we've actually also implemented a mindfulness program with them as well. And we're currently tracking their training and how this is going. And what we know from it, sorry, is if we look at their preseason scores, and then last year we measured them at postseason. So they're kind of color coded, which you cannot see very well on here, but there's a light green, a yellow, and a red. So the light green means that they're significantly changing in the direction that we want to see. So we're seeing a significantly less proportion of them demonstrating poor lumbopelvic control, except for when we look at hip hiking on the right. So this was really interesting. So we had 62 dancers do both pre and postseason last year. And we found that near the end of the year, 7 of them all of a sudden are starting to really hike up their, they're lifting their hip with their leg on the right side. And what's interesting is that this repertoire that they were working on last year has a lot of leg lifting to the right side. So we think this is most likely a training thing, that it's either fatigue or perhaps they've developed that kind of strategy to get their leg to the height that they want it to. But that was the only one that we saw a negative difference in. Their turnout and their eyes closed by dynamic balance on the left increased, but not significantly. But then when we look at their Y balance test, which incorporates balance and strength, we saw significant increases in their reach direction. And then a big one was when we look at their hip adductor strength, which is something their teacher really targeted. We also saw significant increases in that from preseason to postseason. So is that totally due to the conditioning program, or is that partially also because of their training? We don't totally know. We'll still have to parse that out, but we're hoping that it's helping. And then the future, we'll need to look at if their injury rates have gone down from this intervention as well. And that's currently in the works. So yeah, what we have from this specific cohort study is we established some normative values for their preseason. So we told them this is what this means. We gave the staff some areas for improvement. We showed that they are consistently injured, and we introduced a cross-training program. So the future, we're going to be evaluating the effectiveness of that program. And then we're actually coming up on our 10-year follow-up. They'll finish their 10-year. The 10th year will be the 2024 to 2025 season. So we're almost 10 years working with this studio or with this school. So, okay, we've kind of gone through the injury prevention model with this specific cohort. Now, this is an elite group of dancers, and we're kind of jump a little bit to a different study that we've just started this year. So this is in collaboration with some researchers down at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. And we have 2 cohorts, one here in Calgary and one there. But I've just told you about these super elite ballet dancers, but that really isn't incorporating who's dancing in Calgary. What we know is that dancers often begin training in a studio environment. And studio dancers are the group that eventually are going to feed into all these other groups. So they're all these dancers that end up at this school started at a studio at some point. But injury surveillance so far has been limited to professional and pre-professional cohorts. We don't really know anything about these recreational kids or even these competitive studio kids. A master's student in the dance science lab, Ali George, for her thesis, did a cross-sectional study examining participation and injury trends in private studios here in Calgary. And it was a little limited by COVID because people weren't dancing because they were home. But what she was able to determine was that in kids aged 7 to 12 who are dancing, we see a lower injury prevalence. So it's only about 36%. But what we're seeing is that these injuries are 70% acute. So as young kids who are dancing, they are experiencing more accidents in the dance studio and just in life in general. But what they're doing is they're getting these acute injuries, either from falls, trips, whatever. And we're seeing muscle strains and joint sprains. But how do we get from this age group So 7 to 12 who are getting acute injuries. And then when we jump into a pre-professional space, all of a sudden they're all overuse or gradual onset injuries. So is it because the training load has increased? Is it because their actual training changes? Is it because of where they're at in their maturation? So we don't really know. So that's why we are currently doing a study in dancers aged 11 to 18 who are taking one dance class a week at a studio. And the studios we're recruiting are the ones that are teaching at least 3 of those 4 concert dance styles that I mentioned at the beginning. So this is kids who are 13 years old and they take maybe a ballet class a week or a jazz class a week. Or they are dancing at a studio on a competitive team and they're taking 20 hours of class a week and then competing on the weekends. We're trying to look at these populations. So we adapted our dancer screening. So at the ballet school, it takes about 60 to 75 minutes to get them through. That's not going to work when we go to a local studio. So we've shortened it to 10 to 15 minutes. They still do all the surveys, but we took out ankle range of motion measures. We took out some of the lumbo-pelvic control measures, and we added a measure of sitting height to get a more appropriate gauge of their maturation and their growth. This is how they do this. So we developed an online system that's also used in the Shred Concussions program, but we adapted it for dance. And this is where they access their surveys. They're able to log in each week. Clearly, the test person, me, is missing their weekly surveys. I'm not doing a great job, but they are able to complete all their baseline surveys. And then each week they complete those same, they complete the ostracy. So did they get injured last week? And then how much they danced. We did a pilot study of this from March to June this year with 53 dancers at 4 studios. And then for year 1 of the study, we're just wrapping up recruitment, but it started in September. We have about 120 dancers across 10 studios in the city. Preliminary findings from our pilot study, we saw that 12 out of the 53 dancers reported an injury. We saw 17 injuries total, and we saw similar injury prevalence to Allie's master's thesis. So we saw about 32%, and it's not on this slide, but 60% of those were acute. It was a short time period as it was just a pilot study, so we didn't really collect great exposure data, so we don't have an injury rate, but we did see that these kids are experiencing injury at the studio level. This is kind of some more like logistics, practical applications of what we've learned from working in this specific community. So every time we give this presentation about what's going on at the pre-professional ballet school or professional companies, we have dance teachers and dance educators say, well, what about the studio dancers? What about the studio dancers? We want to do this. But then when we go to them, they're all keen, they really want to do it, but all of a sudden there's all these barriers. So a big barrier has been studio space to book a baseline session. So studios are overbooked basically, and it's really hard to find a time where a studio is free to get kids in. There's no good time of the year to do this basically. So they're doing something all year round. In September, registration's busy. In October, competition auditions happen. In December, they do a Christmas show. And then January, they roll into competition season. And then all of a sudden, it's the end of the year. So there's kind of a sweet spot, like mid-July, that you can get a studio owner to say yes. Studio owners often only recruit their competitive team. So we're really finding that they recruit the dancers that they know well because they see them at the studio all the time, but we're still not able to get to those dancers that are just recreational dancers that are dancing for fun. That this isn't their main activity. They're just going to a class because they like to dance. We're not really getting them still. But what we have found is that the biggest selling point is we offer, if they report an injury, they are able to see our athletic therapist for free. And that's a huge selling point for their parents. We book them in, we get them seen. And then the other thing is that we provide a provider list of physios. There's a dance psychologist, there's a nutritionist or a dietitian that work with dancers. And we provide them with that list of people that we know in the community for them to work with, because we found that it's not really a financial decision about who they're going to see. It's more of a trust situation. So I think dancers really struggle when they go see a medical professional and they tell them, well, the way you're not going to get hurt is if you stop dancing. That's not really, they don't view that as an option. So it helps when they feel like there's someone who's worked with dancers before. So we've recommend some of that to them. Yeah, and then we found some keys to success, and these all make sense. But if there's on-site support, either a dance teacher that's really involved, if there's a dancer themselves that's like really gung-ho, or we're in the position that we are actually able to have study staff that go check up on these studios, check up on the dancers and ask if they've gotten an injury, go and remind them to fill out their surveys. It helps if there's built-in time to the schedule. So if they have a conditioning class, or one of the studios we work with actually has a dance science injury prevention class that they make their dancers take. And that's a great time to go in and, or to have that teacher say, for the first 5 minutes of your class, do your surveys. That helps us. And then if the parents are bought in, it makes us much more successful with the dancers themselves if their parents are also on board or know what's happening. Often we've gone to studios and a kid signs up and then 2 months later their parents like, what are you doing? We didn't know you were doing this study. Even though they signed a consent form at some point. I don't really know how that happens, but it helps if everybody's on board and knows what's going on. But really what we've learned is we've tried to take a program that works really well at it's the team sport model, right? So this is how we do it with team sports. We ask them how many injuries they get. We ask them their exposure. We've been able to adapt it for a dance setting in a pre-professional cohort where they're all at one school taking similar courses. But we're finding that when you move this to a individualized dance setting where none of these kids are taking the same class schedule during the week, we can't just go in and ask the coach, hey, who was here this week? Because who knows? They're all over the place. And we also can't ask them how much did they dance, because some of them take 10 classes, some of them take 5, some of them have 6 rehearsals on the weekend that with 6 different choreographers, so nobody really knows. So it's really up to the dancers themselves to report their individual exposure hours and their individual injuries, which is difficult to do when you're 12. Like you've got a whole lot going on at that age. So yeah, we're kind of adjusting is basically what we've learned, that we can't always just take exactly what we know from sport and apply it to dance. We can learn from it. And we want to work together, but it doesn't always translate to the dance context. So based on that, where we're going next is we're almost done recruiting, but we're still looking for younger, more recreational dancers, because we still are kind of getting mostly competitive dancers. We'll be looking at the relationship between growth and maturation and injury, since that's not something we've done before. We've just looked at modifiable pre-screening measures. But what do we know about their growth curve? Are they approaching peak height velocity? Should we be adjusting their training? We don't know that yet, but we're looking into that. We're looking at the influence of sport specialization on these kids. So we have a group that's highly specialized. They, at age 11, they move into a school where they're training half the day, taking class the other half, versus a not so specialized group. And then we're examining some targeted injury prevention strategies. So that cross-training program that we've implemented, we'll be evaluating that in the future as well. So yeah, there's a lot of people to thank, a lot of co-authors and collaborators. We have a great group in the Dance Science Lab and at Critchley. But first of all, thank you for listening to something that maybe is a little outside your realm. And so as a thank you, I'm gonna have everybody stand up and we're gonna do a little dance lesson. I'm just kidding. But yeah, just thanks for listening, and I'm happy to welcome any questions.
Questions? Thanks for the talk. That's really interesting. I danced growing up too, so I like to see some injury prevention stuff going on. Question about your study that you're doing now. Are you also looking at other sports, like the students who are doing other sports, I guess, specifically? Because when I grew up, there's a lot of people who did multiple sports, even at the competitive levels.
So we ask them if they do other sports, and then when they fill out their injury surveys, they have to tell us if it's dance related. So yeah, if they say I fell in a soccer game, we don't include that in our analysis, but we're not exactly looking at the risk factors for those other sport injuries. We're just looking at the dance related ones. But
Yeah, just curious because
yeah.
like training, overtraining, I guess training load for other sports may influence injury rate in dance as well.
Yeah, definitely. And up until now, the cohort we've worked with doesn't have time to do other sports.
Yeah.
So this is kind of a new interest for us to see how many of them actually are doing other sports. And when they do, are they completely overtrained? Is their extra training actually helping them? Yeah, that's something we'll be able to see in the future, I think. Yep.
I'm curious to know, how do dancers usually train? Like, do they, many of them do like a strength and conditioning program aside from the one that you implemented? And does yours, if they do a program, does yours like address the specific risk factors that you addressed? Or
so normally at a dance studio, and then at the ballet school before this, a lot of competitive dancers and pre-professional dancers are required to take a conditioning class during their week. And their conditioning class is most often taught by a former dancer, former ballerina usually. And so what they do is a ton of Pilates mat work. And they love it because they're really good at it and they feel like they're really strong. But what we're finding is that doesn't really, it's basically just taking the training that they already do and laying it down. So they're not doing a lot of closed chain movement. So what we've done is change that to target some of those things that we're seeing. We're trying to work on standing balance rather than just holding your core while you're laying on the ground. We introduced some plyometrics, and that was like, it took probably 2 months before people were okay with what we're doing. That like any kind of training power is really not common. And there's almost zero aerobic training. So you'll find that dancers often have really poor cardiovascular fitness. Because what they do in class is dance a bunch, dance for 2 minutes, take a break, get some corrections, and then start again. It's very intermittent. Yeah.
Two kind of related questions. So what role do you think that, like, we've heard some talks about relative energy? Do you think that in terms of injury risk for dancers that potentially could be amplified because of it's like aesthetic requirements?
Yes, so there's a whole body of literature about REDS in dancers, specifically risk for eating disorders. We did a study on low bone mineral density and found that a pretty significant proportion of them are demonstrating low bone mineral density. Yeah, I think it's more of a culture in dancers where they're encouraged to look a certain way. It's called the Balanchine look, where small head, long limbs, very thin, no hips kind of situation. There's been a lot of conversations about that changing in dance after COVID. But yes, when we go in to teach about aerobic fitness, we don't use any terminology about this can make you thinner, or this is, we purely just talk about heart health. And what we talk about is we want you to be able to perform at a level higher than what you feel like your highest is now. We don't want, when you go on the stage, for that to feel like you're sucking wind at the end. We want you to feel good at the end of that. So that's kind of what we talk about. Another, which I didn't say, is we're actually taking out BMI from our screening. In the past, when we've done weight, we don't let the dancers see their weight. We have them step on backwards and not look at it, but almost every single one of them asks when they get off, what did I weigh? And we say, we won't tell you, you have to do that on your own. But since we haven't found a link with BMI and injury, and a lot of more of the current literature hasn't either, we are removing that from our screening because the negative consequences of BMI in these schools is greater than the potential positives in our minds.
And then do you think that potentially that whole kind of attitude and culture is a barrier for them doing things their strength training? Like, if we have this perception that they're gonna build muscle and that's gonna like make them look less thin.
Yep. So that's really been, that's changed within the last like 5 or 6 years. But if we had the same conversation probably 10 years ago, it would have been that dancers don't lift because they don't want to look bulky. Yeah, when you ask them to lift weights, they're too worried about looking really, really bulky and heavy because they want to be thin and slender.
Just a follow-up on that conversation, I know that when I was dancing, we did do strength and conditioning class, but that can also be a barrier because it's another class they have to take. It's another thing that parents have to pay for. They have to teach, they have to have staff to teach it. They have to have somebody willing to teach it who's educated enough to do it well. So there's like a lot of barriers to it with the structure of the studio specifically right
Yeah.
now.
Might be a stupid question, but is there any insight or information on like the role of the dancer in like what they're practicing for, like if they're a jumper or a lifter? I'm just curious as to whether you have a lot of data on like hours, but not a lot of data on activity. And I assume dancers aren't doing the same thing. Like if you're the lead versus if you're like in the background. So like, is there any insight into that, or does anyone ever put like time used to measure activity or impact?
Yep. So that's the huge limitation to this, to injury surveillance in general, right? We're taking our measure of exposure is purely just volume instead of any intensity measure. So the Royal Academy of Dance in London, they just released a paper with their professional company looking at the effect of roll. They threw some IMUs on some dancers for, I think, 2 seasons. And yeah, looked at, and it totally differs by role. So your lead in Nutcracker, your Clara in Nutcracker, who's dancing the whole time and dancing on point, versus the people in the background that are pretending like they're talking at a party, have a totally different intensity at their rehearsal than it's totally different. So that's kind of the next area that this is moving, is looking at training load. But yeah, so far it's only been done in one professional company who has a ton of funding and a huge staff to make it happen. But it's really great work. Joseph Shaw.
Yeah, you got your hand up before.
Your presentation was basically 2 parts. The first part was your PhD thesis. That said kind of the background, and the second part was what you're going to do in the future. Correct?
Yes, correct.
Now, the first part, the PhD thesis, in which field was that? Was that in biomechanics? Did I use that correctly?
Just kinesiology, injury epidemiology, basically.
Kinesiology.
Yeah.
And what are the major tools that you got in that program, that PhD program?
One of the major tools that I learned.
Yeah.
I mostly what we did is epidemiology training and biostats, a lot of biostats. Yeah, we tried to study with IMUs. It didn't go very well, but other than that, that's really what we used. Yeah.
And the purpose of your PhD thesis was?
To look at injury surveillance and preseason screening in ballet dancers, pre-professional ballet dancers.
So basically filling the number 1 of fundamental.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Now, in the data, you have data where you had something like previous years training.
Yeah, years of previous training. Yeah.
And they were all the same for the first year, the second year, the third year, the fourth year. That means these were not the same subjects anymore. Because if you would add them, then you would get more and more and more.
I think it was just their average years of previous training. So on average, each year they had about 8 years of previous training in the cohort. So the cohort changed each year. We had 10 dancers that did all 5 seasons, but there was a group of new dancers each year.
Were any of the subjects anorexic?
We don't have that data. That's really hard to get through ethics to ask, because it's a sensitive subject with them, and we don't have a psychologist on our research team that can handle that if they divulge that they are. We have people we could refer them to, but we ourselves are not equipped to answer that. But yes, anecdotally, yes, every year we have dancers come in that say last year they had to see the school psychologist because they were struggling with anorexia or an eating disorder. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions about the battery of tests that you use for your screening. So I think the first one is the range of motion screen, which is interesting because usually from my limited reading in this area, this is often used to identify deficiencies in range of motion, which have, especially in the ankle, which have upstream effects on the joint mechanics. So what are you evaluating? I can't imagine a dancer having many joint like flexibility issues. Are you measuring like too much motion?
So there is some research in hypermobility that we're not doing. The original, so this started in 2015, and the original inclusion of ankle range of motion was because there was a study out of a professional company that showed decreased dorsiflexion led to increased injury. But decreased dorsiflexion for a dancer is different than somebody than a non-dancer. But there's been more and more literature published, including our own, that hasn't found that same association, which is why we actually took the ankle range of motion testing out of the studio dancers, because it takes forever. Most of them have enough, so we don't really do it. When we publish the normative values, we also publish percentiles. So when we give feedback to the dancers at the school at the end of their season or at the end of their screening, if they're curious, we tell them where they fall, but yeah, we don't really use that one that much. None of them seem to be concerned with their range of motion there.
Right.
Their hip range of motion, a lot of them are concerned about. So it used to be that ballet teachers taught that when I was talking about that external turnout or their hip turnout, it used to be taught that you wanted 180 degrees. So you wanted a complete flat line, which is impossible. Like that shouldn't happen. Yeah, if you try it, you can't get there unless you torque at the knee or something else. And so now how we use that is to say, this is where your natural turnout lies. So don't force it in class. You shouldn't be going any further. Because now we can choreograph to make sure that you don't have to have 180 degrees of turnout.
Nice. So the other test that I'm interested in is the straight leg raise, which you're using to evaluate lumbopelvic control. Is this a fairly standard test in dance? And how do you what is a good performance of that? Is it like a scoring system, or are you measuring the dissociation of the thorax?
It's a scoring system, so it's a 0, 1, 2, or 3. And what you're looking at is basically if they're when they're laying flat, if their hip is rising to lift their leg. It's a super subjective test. So we have a physiotherapist do it because they're trained in the test. I think what we're finding is that so far, there needs to be some standardization of how we're measuring core control in these dances, and this probably is not the test for it, but it's what we have at the moment. And so really we're doing it just to compare with other literature from other people, but yeah, there's been a huge call for a standardized lumbopelvic control test within the dance science community.
So after you do all your battery tests, you then implement conditioning for the dancers to continue. Is it standardized every week? Is it periodized? Do you have progressions to make it harder as you get better at the exercise? Or is it just the same thing that they repeat for 6 weeks or 6 months?
So we just did it last year, and it's actually led by one of their teachers at the school, but it is progressive. Mostly because at the beginning of the year, she was really trying to just teach them basics. Yeah. So this year is really the first year that she's actually really getting into it with them. And she's doing 6-week rotations that progress throughout the year. Yeah.
do you think that through eventually continuing to do more conditioning, strength and conditioning will be accepted in the
I think it's already there. So like when I just came from a dance medicine and science conference last month actually, and yeah, that's the current hot topic is integrating strength and conditioning. Professional companies all have a strength and conditioning coach now on staff. And that will eventually trickle down, but it usually takes about 15 years from what we're doing in the professional companies to get down to what we're doing at a studio level. A big barrier to what's going on at a studio level is dance doesn't have a governing board or a regulatory institution. So it's not like with soccer, we don't have Alberta Hockey Association or Alberta Dance Association. So there's no, basically you could walk into a studio tomorrow and say, I want to be a dance teacher. And like, hopefully the studio owner's like, have you ever danced before? But if not, you don't have to have any qualifications. You don't have to have any certifications. And any of you tomorrow could say, I want to open a dance studio. I think it's going to make a ton of money. It won't, but you could. And there's nobody saying you have to follow these rules or anything like that. So that's kind of why it takes forever for any science or evidence-based practices to kind of get down to the grassroots level.
Yep. So you mentioned that a lot of the ballet dancers have mental health issues, right? So I was wondering if you recorded medication use among them, and maybe you can correlate then with injury risk because certain medication, especially psychotropic medication, may influence balance or other issues.
Yeah, that's a great idea. We ask them what they're supposed to fill out what medications they're taking. But yeah, we haven't looked at that. That's a great area to maybe pursue and see. Yeah, I'm not sure. We don't really ask them if they've had any mental health diagnoses. We just have them fill out the coping skills inventory. But from their medication history, we could probably tell why they're taking something. So that would be a great suggestion. Thank you.
And maybe follow up on a couple of questions, like this one, for example, because you mentioned that like as a risk factor, coping skills. How do you evaluate coping skills, and what do you mean by that?
It's a adapted, so it's a previously validated survey. It's a 28 question survey.
Like a questionnaire.
Yeah, it's a questionnaire that we use that we adapted for dance. Actually, we didn't even adapt it; somebody else did, and we're using it. But the questions are basically like how it's a Likert scale, 1 to 5, and it's how do you, I feel hurt when my artistic director gives me a correction, or I feel nervous before I go on stage. They're like that kind of.
The other thing that I want to follow up is when you talked about the shape of a ballet dancer, I guess a female ballet dancer, and it reminded me a little bit of gymnastics 20 years ago, where everybody was skinny and small hips, as you mentioned it, but now more and more you have very powerful, strong women in gymnastics. Do you foresee at all that might be changing in dance as well?
I think if you look at, I don't foresee it changing in classical ballet anytime soon. I think it's totally changed in modern and contemporary dance, even in contemporary ballet. But yeah, we're doing the gap from Nastia Liukin to Simone Biles is kind of what you're talking about right now. And
exactly.
Are we getting there? In some genres of dance, but classical ballet, it's just so traditional, and it's a struggle. But what's interesting though is in classical ballet, it wasn't until George Balanchine in the 60s said that they should be, these straight line, thin, tiny head people. Before that, they weren't like that. Before that, it started in royal courts, and then they were a little curvier. And so I think maybe it'll cycle back again, but I think it's going to take a minute.
It reminds me, I saw once, many years ago, I saw a ballet performance. It was called Big Bertha. And it was with a very tall, trying female dancer, and more often than not, when she was carried by 2 men. And I thought that was actually really interesting because it kind of defied defied, so to speak, the norm that is very tall, presumably heavier
Mhm.
dancer was, was taking on the role, like the primary role.
I mean, that is the one thing to say about dance and art in general is the whole point is to challenge what we as society view, right? So, there's already ballets being choreographed with men on point and women in flat, and men partnering men and women partnering women. And so, yes, there's a cultural shift in dance, and it's always trying to challenge the social norm. So hopefully the social norm changes to also these people don't have to be incredibly thin. Instead, they just need to be healthy, but we'll see.
It's good that you talk about male female, because I wanted to talk a bit about that, because it seems to me when I watch ballet, men and women have very distinctly different roles, and so I would assume they also have very distinct different injuries.
Yeah, so that's at the school level, there's always way more women than there are men. And we didn't have enough men to really stratify what kind of injury types they're getting. But it's a little different. We see more lower back injuries in the male dancers at the school than we do the female dancers, and that's because they're partnering, they're lifting. But when you look at the professional level, that is a little more clear. Yeah, men experience back injuries. They're still experiencing a lot of lower limb injuries because the men jump. That's what they do in the show, is huge jumps. So you actually see more acute lower limb injuries in the men, like ACL tears and stuff like that.
And yeah, I wanted to come a little bit to that as well, because you mentioned where the injuries occurred, but you talked very, very little about what injuries they were, and you talked mostly about chronic injuries, not so much ACL injuries. So,
yeah.
So what is the typical or the two typical injuries chronic injuries that you have seen in ballet dance?
We see a lot of patellofemoral pain syndrome in the knee, especially in these growing dancers. A lot of Achilles tendonitis, plantar fasciitis is huge. Some ankle sprains, but yeah, mostly those things. Oh, and a lot of snapping hip. What's the actual term for snapping hip?
Hip dislocation?
No.
Hip impingement syndrome?
Yeah, maybe.
I wanted to ask about hip impingement syndrome, because people that are like whatever you call that position,
yeah,
they seem to be more prone to get hip impingements. And hockey players have that more than runners and things. So I was wondering if that was a common occurrence especially in female ballet dancers as well.
Yes, not in our cohort, which was surprising to us, but yes, in other cohorts, super common.
And then the second thing of your scheme is mechanisms. And we mentioned hours. If I do 1,000 hours of dancing, I have such a chance. But do you think you can be a little bit more precise about what might be causing certain injuries, and therefore maybe what you should avoid doing too often?
I think that's the goal that we eventually want to get to. I think that kind of comes back to Bill's question about, can we also look at intensity of training? Can we use IMUs to maybe see what kind of things are happening in a class? So are they jumping the whole time? Are they rolling? Are they running? But that we have a lot of work to do there to get to that point. I think it's really resource heavy in this type of cohort. So if anybody wants to do a PhD, we would love to have that happen.
Looking at the movement and what people are doing, I think is maybe one thing. But from the sport that I'm coming, I always say, some people cannot run 20 kilometers a week and they get injured, and other people can run 200 kilometers a week and they never get injured.
Yeah.
And so I think there might also be some biological differences. Have you ever tried to see not from a movement point of view, but from a biology point of view, what type of dancer is more prone to injury compared to another?
No, I don't. I'm not familiar with any literature well, I know for sure our group hasn't done that. And then I don't know that I've seen that literature in dance. We always say in dance science that we're about 10 to 15 years behind sports science. But that's way far behind for us if we haven't done any kind of.
For example, in the cohort that you're looking at, you know, do you find that certain people just get injured a lot and then others go through your 5-year study and they were never injured?
Yep.
You know, despite the
Yes.
fact that they essentially do the same training.
Yes, we see the same people every year that are, like I can think of one dancer who's participated in all 9 years of the study so far, and without a fail, this dancer is our most injured participant every year. And then yeah, there's people who have also done 7 or 8 years of the study and been totally fine the whole time. So there's clearly some individual differences at some point. I don't have the data or any indication of why that is at the moment. Like totally just seems to be random chance at the moment. It's not, but yeah, definitely an area for future study.
So what's your favorite dance performance that you've ever seen?
Ooh, that's a good question. Probably, and I actually have an answer for this. I'm shocked. So last year, the Royal Winnipeg Ballet came and did Handmaid's Tale. They visited the Alberta Ballet and did Handmaid's Tale, and it was incredible, like mind-blowing. I didn't want to go, but it was really good.
When I was at the University of Iowa, they always had a summer dance school. There's Martha Graham Dance Theatre, and there's the Joffrey Ballet.
Yeah.
And one year, Martha Graham, she probably was 117 years old.
You've seen Martha Graham?
I saw Martha Graham.
Wow.
Somewhere in the early 1980s, and she came and she actually talked after the performance, and she explained the performance, and then they showed Appalachian Spring.
Ah.
It's my favorite.
Oh my goodness. Did I ever think that Walter Herzog would have seen Martha Graham? No, but
I go to decide Jazz Dance Works whenever they have a performance.
good. They're my favorite company.
Our faculty used to have dance at noon performances.
Yep.
You know, with the
Dance.
previous
Yeah.
colleagues that we had, and I love that.
Well, there we go. Let's bring in DJ D. Let's bring in DJ D for the Christmas party. Yeah.
I don't have that petite, hips type of thing.
I really should have done an interactive session where we all had to dance through this.
But he looks like the dance.
He does. He fit right in. Oh, 2 in the back. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. One thing that I got my attention was the number of the days that they like a medical leaves or rest. So I know that it's very competitive activities there, but now in professional sport you have to take your rest. And what is going on in ballet that is because there is no rest, any rest, and
I think what's going on is one, they're not telling people when they're injured. So we go in and do a workshop every year and I ask them to tell me, what's the difference between good pain and bad pain? And basically all pain is good pain for these dancers. And they're like, bad pain is only if I have to go to the hospital, which is not what we want to hear. At the professional level, what I think is happening is that if they have an injured dancer that has an injury that's just chronic and bothering them, I think they change the choreography is what happens. At a school level, they're just modifying during class. So they're either, if they can't jump, they don't jump and they do something else. But yeah, even in my university study, in my dance program in university, you were penalized if you didn't come to class. So if you were injured or if you were sick, even, you were expected to do something else in class if you couldn't participate in what we're doing, but you were expected to be there and figure out some way to modify is kind of what's happening. Yeah.
I recall you putting up one of the measures, one of the outcomes you looked at was, or in your pre-assessment was bone density, or several measures of bone density, but I didn't see any reporting of those results, and you haven't really mentioned any like stress fracture or bone related injuries. I'm just curious what your results are on that, or perspective, or maybe that's ongoing?
Yep, so we did DEXA the first year. We measured bone mineral density the first year, and didn't find anything really. We found that some of them had low bone mineral density, but not like a, I mean, it was a proportion of them, but not alarming proportion. Yeah, and then when we looked at their association with injury and even their association with previous bone injury, we didn't really find anything in this particular cohort. When we've done a secondary analysis comparing this cohort's bone mineral density data to some sport controls, so some people who participated in recreational sport, and they do have significantly less bone mineral density at all sites compared to, especially at the lower extremity, which we thought they would have more. But they still fall within normal values. They're not, yeah, so.
And stress fractures aren't too common in ballet, or maybe?
They are common in ballet. In this cohort, they're not. So, whatever they're doing at the school is working for them stress fracture wise. Yeah. But other cohorts, yeah, definitely a common injury.
Great presentation, thank you. Maybe I missed this, but have you, I know people were talking about REDs earlier, have you done any work to actually have an idea of what their energy availability is, and if there are dancers who are at that point, or is that something that would be really difficult for them to agree to do or to get ethics for? Because I think that would be interesting to look at. If potentially the dancers that are not being, can make it through 9 years and not be injured,
Yeah.
what does that have to do with that at all?
Yeah. It's definitely something we're interested in doing. We haven't. So if you have a potential master's or PhD student that has the time and interest in doing it, please send them our way. But yeah, that's totally something we'd be interested in doing. We just haven't yet, basically.
Do you think that's something that dancers would be willing to? I know asking them about
I think
eating disorders and stuff is really touchy. Is that something, those types of questionnaires, would they be willing to do those?
I think so. One of the benefits to doing these long longitudinal studies is that we've been present at this school for almost 10 years now. And that's changed the culture at this school, right? So they have a culture of wellness, of injury prevention. We are there often. So I think yes, but that's because we've established a relationship with this particular school. If I were to just walk into another professional company, even DJD maybe, I think there would maybe be some hesitancy. Yeah, but I don't know. Dancers are always surprising, so it could be that they are really interested in knowing that.
Use like self-reported measures for like measuring that they were misreport potentially because they don't have to flag with someone who's underrated.
I think self-report would probably go better than the alternative. Who they don't want to know is their artistic director. So if it's a team, if it's a research team that's safe, that they can report to, and if it's a self-reported measure that they don't feel like is ever going to get back to their artistic director or their teacher, I think they're much more likely to be honest about what's going on. But to get that kind of study approved, you usually have to say if somebody is flagged, we have to report it. We can't just let it go. And so if you do say, by the way, if you let us know you have something, we have to tell someone, I think that would maybe discourage people from being honest.
I was curious about the cost of the dance on healthcare system, and one has done any study of that.
Sorry, I'm deaf. Can you repeat your question?
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay.
I was curious about the cost of the dance injuries on healthcare system, or in specifically the athletes themselves.
Yeah. You're asking about
have done that.
You're asking about the cost?
Yeah.
Other people have done that, and I should know this. But I don't have a great answer for you right now, but I can find out and tell you. I know it's been done. I can't remember it off the top of my head.
If you remember if it was a large number or it was a smaller number? millions or billions of dollars?
I don't know. It's not huge. It's not, no, it's not huge, partially because arts are super underfunded, right? So even somebody dancing in a professional company is probably only making, unless they have a principal role, they might only be making about $20,000 a year. So, and if they're dancing in the States, they probably don't have health insurance. So it's costing them, but it's not costing the healthcare system anything. Probably because they're not going. So, but yeah, dancers are not making lots of money. So if they are missing out on this, if we're trying to determine what the cost of them getting an injury is, and we're looking at their salary loss, it's gonna look like it's nothing, but to them it's a lot. Yeah.
Awesome. Let's thank Meghan again.